What's up guys, welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to continue with our form styling, and in this lesson we're going to look at radio buttons and checkboxes. So let's just make sure we're on the same page. What is a radio button? What is a checkbox? A checkbox is something that can be clicked on and toggled to either true or false. So you can see either that checkbox is checked or it's not. If the user clicks on a checkbox that's already checked, then it becomes unchecked. Radio buttons are a little bit different. We can't uncheck a radio box, but what we can do is select another radio box, and that will automatically uncheck the other radio box. So you can see these are mutually exclusive. Either I have radio button set to true, or I have it set to false in this case. Styling these is a lot more tricky than just styling text input and buttons. And one of the key concepts to being able to style these is to understand that there is some default system styling that's being applied to these buttons. And the first step in order to make progress is to get rid of that default system styling. So an important property and value to remember is, let's style all of our input fields in fact, and we're going to set the appearance property to none. We'll get to see what our form looks like with any of that default browser styling. This is going to give us much more flexibility and control over those radio buttons and checkboxes. So what we're seeing now is without that default system styling, but if we remove appearance none, this is how those buttons are going to look by default with the default styling. So making use of appearance none, the first thing you'll probably notice is that our radio buttons have disappeared and our checkbox has completely disappeared as well. So we need to start with that. Now we can target our checkbox with the ID of checkbox. So I'm going to use #checkbox. And the main problem here is that we don't have a border on our checkbox because that's part of the default styling. It's gone at the moment. So let's set a border of solid 1 pixel gray. And you can see a very, very small border has appeared there. We couldn't really use this checkbox at the moment. That's because we also need some width and height. So let's set width 21 pixels and height 21 pixels. And there we go, we have a checkbox. Might be too large, you can customize this however you want. That's the whole point, right? If we wanted a smaller checkbox, we could say 15. There we go, that looks more like a regular size for a checkbox. And we can also kind of see that compared to the line of text, the label for checkbox, this checkbox is too high. And we can configure that with vertical align. And we can set a value, probably a negative value in this case. Let's try -5 pixels. So we can now see that the checkbox lines up with the checkbox label, which is what we want. Now you can see at the moment, if we click on that checkbox, nothing happens because that blue tick that we saw being rendered previously is actually part of the default styling. So we have a checkbox that doesn't even work. It's not so much the checkbox doesn't work, it just doesn't have any styling specifically associated with it being checked. So we don't really have a good way of knowing whether this checkbox has been checked or not. So this is where things start to get interesting. We can actually make use of a pseudo element, and the pseudo element we're going to use is before. And the pseudo element before sets the first child on an element. So it's going to be something that prefixes all of that element's content. So we also need to specify the content for the pseudo element. So for example, if we put content X and refresh, let's make sure we're targeting our element correctly with checkbox. So refresh, and now we see an X inside that checkbox. Now we appear to be making some progress, but we can't toggle that X. It's also messed around with the layout of the checkbox, so it's no longer lining up with the text. So it's possible we've created more problems than we've actually solved here. So let's see if we can start solving some of these problems. But the key takeaway here is that we can use that before pseudo element. We can set content, and now we can see that X is appearing inside the checkbox. Now the first thing we're going to do is see if we can make that X toggle based on the state of the checkbox. Then we'll worry about the rest of the styling afterwards. So we can make use of the visibility property, and this can control whether an element actually appears on the page. So if we were to set visibility to hidden, that X is now going to disappear. We can also make use of another pseudo class which controls the state of the checkbox. So if we say checkbox checked, Remember that pseudo classes have 1 colon, whereas pseudo elements have 2 colons. So we're actually going to use both in this selector. So what do we have here? We are styling the checkbox specifically once it's been checked, and we're targeting that first child using the before pseudo element. So what can we do here? We can simply say visibility, visible. All right, let's check out our checkbox. No pun intended. So you can see we actually have a working checkbox, but to be honest, right now it looks worse than the default checkbox. So let's see if we can fix the styling. Now let's think about a new CSS concept, which we'll explore in a bit more depth later on in the course. And that's the concept of position in CSS. Now you don't need to know the full details of how this works, but we're going to make use of the position property on the checkbox, and we're going to set the position to relative. Then for checkbox before, we're going to set the position to absolute. Now, in short, what this allows us to do is it allows us to position this X or this check relative to its parent container. So the parent container is the checkbox element itself. The child is this checkbox before, and we've given that position absolute. So it's going to be positioned absolutely relative to that parent container, the checkbox. Now we can see straight away that this has actually fixed the layout. So now our checkbox is appearing horizontal relative to the label. Now, when we have an element with position of absolute, we can also position it using top, right, left, and bottom values. So let's experiment with this. I'm going to set top to 1 pixel, and let's see where our X appears. The X is too far down, so let's try a negative value for this. We can see the X moves upwards. And let's try positioning horizontally as well. Let's start off with -1 pixel and see what we get. The X is too far over to the right now. So let's try a positive value for this. You can see almost to the center. Let's try right 2 pixels. The point is, you can play around with this. You might need to tweak the size of the checkbox itself, but eventually you're going to get something that looks centered. So we have something that works. So where does the customization come in? Well, for a start, we could set the color on this. So for example, we could set this to dark cyan. And now that's pretty cool. We have a checkbox that ties in with our theme. And we've arbitrarily given this checkbox a gray solid 1 pixel border, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could also be a dark cyan 2 pixel border, for example, if we preferred. And we can make use of the various border styles if we wanted to. So just as a recap, we could set something like dashed here, and we have completely custom checkbox right now. Now, the other thing we might be wondering about is, are we limited to that X? The X is perfectly functional as a checkbox, but we saw by default we actually had a tick. But what if we wanted something completely different, like an image, for example, inside that checkbox? Well, one of the cool things here is we can actually make use of any Unicode character, and there's over 140,000 of these. So if we just pick something at random, let's try this cyclone emoji. Let's copy that. It almost feels like we shouldn't be able to do this, but we can actually just paste that in. Now let's refresh. So you can see we actually have a cyclone emoji checkbox. Not that you'd necessarily choose that for a checkbox. You would probably choose a tick or some kind of cross, and there's plenty of Unicode ticks you can make use of. Now, of course, one thing we can see is that this has messed up the positioning. So we have to maybe go through this process again to get things in the right place. Let's just try it with this element. Let's see if we can get it roughly centered. This needs to be a negative value by the looks of things. This is just trial and error, by the way. That's close to the center. Let's see if we can sort out the horizontal line now. So this probably needs to be a negative value as well. Let's just try -2. That's too much, so -1. Now, if you get this far and you decide that it's not quite centered, and we look at this, well, actually, to be fair, that is pretty well centered. It might need to go upwards a bit. The other thing here is it almost feels like it doesn't quite fit in the box. So we could actually just change this. For example, we could set it to an 18 pixel box, for example. The key concept here is you might need to play around with these values until you get something exactly where you want it to be. So obviously that kind of messes up the center. You only really need to do this once you've got it exactly where you want it to be. And you have your centered element. That looks pretty good, right? Good enough. You could tweak it a bit further if you want to. So now we have a completely custom checkbox with a cyclone emoji loading up inside of it. Now regarding the radio buttons, they can be configured in more or less the same way. Well, there is one key difference with radio buttons, and that's that they are circular rather than square. In fact, let's just set our border back to solid. I think I preferred that on the checkbox because we'll also use the same border now for the radio buttons. So we can once again target this by using hashtag radio because those elements have been given the ID of radio. And the first thing we're going to do is set a border so we can see the element. It's going to be solid 1 pixel dark cyan. And once again, you can see very, very small, tiny border loads up. That's because the element doesn't have any width or height at the moment. So let's give it a height of 20 pixels and a width of 20 pixels. Let's have a look. So you can see the key problem immediately is that our radio buttons are square. Now there's nothing wrong with this. You could have square radio buttons. This is one of the advantages of being able to completely customize the element is we don't need to have circle radio buttons just because everyone else does. We could have square radio buttons. Why not? But let's just assume we want that original functionality. How can we make this square into a circle? Well, one of the simple ways of doing that is to use a high value for border radius. So let's set border radius to 20 pixels. And remember, it's relative to the elements. This is quite a high value given that the element only has a height or width of 20 pixels. So I guess that could be a rule of thumb. If you set the border radius to the same as the height and width of the element, you're probably going to get a pretty good circle. Now, once again, we can see that there's probably some vertical align that needs tweaking there. So let's set the vertical align on those. Previously, it was -5 pixels. Let's see if a similar value does the job. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. Of course, you might not want them on the same horizontal axis as each other. You can configure that as well if you want to. Right now, we can see they are in line with the label. And the label here is radio true and radio false. Now, we have the same kind of issue. We can't actually click these at the moment. They need the same styling as the checkbox. I kind of like this moon with the face just because it's circle as well, similar to the shape of the radio checkbox themselves, similar to the shape of the radio button themselves. So let's copy that. And we'll just start this out again just because this was a little bit more complex. So it's good to do this one more time just to make sure everything's clear. So we're going to set radio. We're going to set before content value, and we're going to paste in our moon with the face. And it feels like it shouldn't really work, but it does. So remember on the parent, we need position relative. Again, don't worry too much about this right now if you don't get exactly what it's doing. We're going to talk about this when we discuss CSS position. Just know for now that the parent needs to be position relative and the child needs to be position absolute. That's just going to give us control over the checkbox itself so we can centrally position it inside the element. Now we can see it loads up, which is great. Already looks pretty well centered, so we like that. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't work yet, and that's because we need to configure the visibility depending on the state of those radio buttons. So we'll set visibility property to hidden, and we're now going to style a combination of a pseudo class and a pseudo element. So the pseudo class here is going to be the same as it was for checkbox, which is checked, and the pseudo element is going to be before. And we can simply say visibility visible. So this is why syntax highlighting is useful. By the way, notice I have one of those colons in red. It's because I have these colons backwards. So the pseudo class should have 1 colon, and the pseudo element, which is before, should have 2 colons. Let's try that. So now you can see it's either one or the other. You can either choose radio true or radio false. Another thing you could do if you really wanted to is you could create a solid color circle using background. For example, let's set background color to dark cyan. So we now see we have a solid background color on that first radio box. Remember, we have this option to say background clip, and we can set that to content box. So the reason why we can't really see that white line around the edge of the inside of the radio button there is because we don't have enough padding. So let's set the padding to 1 pixel. There we go. We can see we have a solid color. We set the padding a bit higher. This might be the kind of thing we associate with a radio button. So essentially we could style that background to appear or not to appear based on the state of the element. So you can see there's more than one way of achieving the same thing, But the key takeaways from this is we can now create radio buttons and checkboxes which tie in with the overall theme of our site. Also, a couple of slightly more advanced concepts which is really good to take note of. Firstly, this pseudo class checked, which is going to style a radio button or checkbox based on whether it has been selected or not. And also this pseudo class before, which allows us to add the first child of an element and basically prefix that element's content with some text, or as we've seen, a Unicode character that includes emoticons and other images. Okay, so we still need to think about our date input. So we'll take a look at that and other form elements in the next part of the course.